So, hi everyone. I hope we can all hear me and that the sound is fine. Okay, today I'm going to be talking to you about Redux middleware for React applications. So I just want to say thank you all for tuning in today. I know with the whole it's hectic out there with the whole pandemic, so I hope that today we can just learn stuff and have fun. Okay, so to introduce myself, my name is Jemima Bloom. I am a self-taught front-end developer and a school-taught systems engineer from Lagos, Nigeria, currently working at Telesoftas in Lithuania. So I like to build websites. And I like to try out new technologies for building websites. So far, my favorite is HTML because it is it does what it's supposed to do. But in a professional capacity, I do work with React a lot. So in my spare time, I like to try out new projects, try out new concepts of technologies, just see, play around with them. And in doing so, I have come across certain concepts that I have found harder to grasp than others. Redux was one of those concepts. So what I like to do basically is I like to explain things to people in the way that I would want it explained to me. So basically, I'm giving this talk because this is the kind of talk I would have wanted to receive when I was getting started with Redux. Okay, so let's just kick it. So the first thing we're going to do is define what Redux is. So now I assume most people, I assume we have some sort of prior knowledge on React. So I'm not really going to go into state and everything. But for Redux, it's basically a JavaScript library for managing states. That's that is the simplest way to explain it. It's a JavaScript library for managing states. So when I think about Redux, I think of imagine you have a function, right? So now in your function, you can have a local variable or you can have a global variable. Local variables are limited to the scope of that function, but global variables are accessible to all functions regardless. So that's just how I like to think of Redux. Redux creates a global state that is accessible to every single component, as opposed to a local state that's only accessible to the component that it's initialized in. Okay, then how Redux works. This was one of the stoppers for me because I would Google how Redux works and I would see this chart and I'm like, what? Okay, so I'm going to explain this in the way that I understood it when I saw this chart. So we start from the UI. You have your UI. Your UI serves as your component or your view. And then your UI dispatches an action. So the process of dispatching an action is basically calling a function. You know when you click a button and it says handle button click? That's how I like to think of it. So the UI dispatches an action. That action is in turn passed to the reducer. And this was the part that stumped me a bit. Now actions are commands, basically. Reducers are things that carry out these commands. Reducers carry out these commands and use them to update the store. And the store is where your state is kept. And then, no, it's still going. And then when the reducer updates the store passes down the updated state back to the UI. So that's the process of subscription. It's just updating the state and passing it to the UI. So now this explanation is one way to explain it, but for me, this was what really brought it home. So think of your store as a literal store. You have an actual a grocery store or whatever. The state of your store is, let's say it's all the goods that are currently present. So the state of your store is all the goods present in that shop. And then the reducer, think of the reducer as an employee or, yeah, an employee of the store, clerk or whatever. And then the action is, think of it like the employee's job descriptions. So now you issue the actions to the employee, you issue the actions to the reducer. So you give tasks to your employee to carry out. And then the employee carries them out and updates the state. So the employee is responsible for updating the state of the store. And then the person calling the actions, so the view in this case, it can be like a customer or a manager. It's just something that triggers the need for an action to be called. So I think that was the base explanation for me. So right here, we have an example of an action file. So this would be like a typical action file. The first thing you do is that you export a string, basically a string variable. So think of this string variable as a duty, the duty that your reducer can carry out. So the string here we're using is stock shelf, still going with the whole store analogy. And then below we have something called an action creator. So action creators are basically functions that carry out actions, pretty much. They can take in parameters and then return types of actions with the parameters. So it's one thing to know that your employee's job description is to stock a shelf, but now you want to know how to tell the employee how to stock the shelf, basically. So you need to stock the shelf with cans, and then in these cans you can pass across information like number of cans or brand or yada yada yada. So that's what action creators are. That's like the main difference between actions and action creators. Then for reducers, so here we have our employee reducer. That's our reducer function. So the reducer takes in, I like to think of the reducer as a literal reducer. When you think of array.reduce, for example, it takes in two values like the accumulator and the base value, and then it returns a single value. So that's how I like to think of reducers. They take in two values, the state. So the state would be like the initial state. So here we have an empty string shelf. So just think of it as an empty shelf. That's the initial state. Initially, the shelf is empty. And then it takes in the action. So the action is whichever action was dispatched. So now you want your employee to be able to know basically think of it like you're trying to automate your employee, right? If he receives an action this, then he should do this. So that's pretty much how we're calling our reducers. We have the case stock shelf. So if you receive like an order or a duty of stocking the shelf, then you should return the updated shelf. So the updated state here would be shelf with the actions of cans. So if we go back to our actions here, we see that cans was the parameter that was passed to the action creator, and that's the parameter we're calling here. So it's going to return the updated state with the shelf set to the value of cans. Yeah. And so the thing with reducers follow certain parameters. They operate on the principle of functional programming, basically. So reducers have to be pure function. So that means that they must always return a value. That's pretty much what it is. Reducers always have to return a value. They cannot have any side effects. So side effects are things like mutating variables or console.logging values, or basically just doing anything that isn't related to returning that function. That's what we call a side effect. And then reducers have to be synchronous. So a reducer cannot call two actions at the same time. It cannot it cannot update states like in asynchronously. It has to be synchronous. It has to call one action and then call another action. It cannot run side by side. And then it has to be predictable. Predictability means that if you're passing an exact value, you should always get the exact return value, basically. So think of it as a mathematical equation. 2 plus 2 should always give you 4, regardless of which climate you're in or what time of the night you're calculating it. 2 plus 2 will always be 4. That is predictable, and that is how reducers work. So that brings us to main topic today. What is middleware? Now, based on these things we know about reducers, we know that reducers have to be reducers have to be pure, and they have to not mutate state. They should not have side effects, all of these things. So that means that you cannot handle certain things within your reducer. But then because you're working with Redux, you can only update your state within a reducer. You cannot update your state within a local component. So that brings us to the question, how do we handle updating the states in a way that still follows the function of reducers? And that's where middleware comes in. So middleware is a tool for handling side effects between actions and reducers. So what that means, you have your action. The action is dispatched. The middleware takes in that dispatched action. It runs the side effects. It runs whatever you want to do, whatever changes you want to make, whatever calls you want to make. And then it passes that modified action to the reducer. And then the reducer just updates the states based on that modified action. Okay. Now, when to use middleware? The truth is that with all technology, you don't really need to use everything in your code. There are times that you use React, there are times you don't need React. So same thing applies to middleware. You shouldn't use middleware if you don't need to. You shouldn't use middleware if you don't need to update your state in unpredictable manners. I think that's the easiest way to say it. So if you're not making any API calls, or you're not you don't require anything that cannot be handled in a reducer, then you don't need middleware. If you're just doing like a simple notes app or a simple to-do list, you don't need middleware. Okay, but then when you do need middleware, you need it to do anything that would be a side effect. So asynchronous requests. If you're going to say you want to set the states of you want to set your global states to collect a value from an API. So you need to make a fetch request and then log that set that request, the response from the request to your states. You can't do that inside your reducer because that is a side effect. That fetch request you're making, it's not directly linked to returning a value. So it counts as a side effect. That's where middleware comes in. So you make your asynchronous requests or your API calls or all your fetching, you make them within your middleware. And that's how it handles that. Say you want to log things, you want to do error handling or catching errors or logging errors. Once again, this would be a side effect because it's not directly linked to the return function. You can do that in your middleware. If you want to change the route, for example, based on which kind of state is returned, rerouting, still a side effect, still done in your middleware. If you need to make periodic updates to your state, let's say the state should be updated every 5 seconds or so, that is also a side effect because you need to use like a set interval function, for example. So you want to keep all of that in your middleware. The reason for this is because, like we've explained, reducers have a set way of working because React tries to be like a pure Redux, my bad. Redux tries to be like a pure flow, everything is predictable. You pass this in, you get this in kind of pattern. So middleware, basically think of it as it handles all the dirty work that the reducers shouldn't handle. It's like a hitman of Redux. So how to use middleware. So now when you're starting out with your middleware, it's possible to write custom middleware, and I don't know why you don't to, but it is possible to do that. And basically how that works is you need to write the function that takes in. Okay. Now the thing with this is one of the concepts I found hardest to grasp because it's just a lot. So middleware is based on a function called currying, on a pattern called currying. So currying is when you return functions from functions, basically. So you have a function, that function returns a function, which in turn returns a function, and so on and so forth. What middleware does, let me just break this down. The first function you have is the store. So within this function, you can place anything that you need any code that you need to modify the store, for example. So code here is called when you supply your middleware function to Redux. So when the application first boots, it calls the code that's within this store function. After the store function, you go to a next function. Now this next function, the purpose of this next function is to pass on the action to the next middleware. It's possible to have multiple middlewares in your code. So at every point, you want to pass on one action to the next middleware, to the next middleware, until it's completely done, and then you pass it to the reducer. So that brings us to the third function, which is the action function. So here, this is where you can actually modify your action or make all your API calls or anything you want to do. And then finally, we return the next action. So what next action does is that it literally just sends the action, it just sends it on its merry way. It's like, all right, I'm done with you. You can move on to the next one. And it moves on to the next one until it's done with all the middleware, and then it's just passed the reducers. So that's it. Then here we have an example of, so going back to our store analogy, we have our update shelf middleware. So like, let's say you want your employee, his job is to stock shelves, right? But before he stocks the shelves, you want to know how many cans are on the shelf currently. That's not in your employee's job description. Like, I'm sorry, but you don't pay them enough for that. So they're not going to do it. Their job is just to stock shelves. So now you need someone to come in and tell you how many cans are on the shelf. That's what the middleware does. Think of the middleware as like I'd call it a temp, maybe an intern that comes in and it does this side work while you're. Now the thing is, let's say your employee has gone to the store to get the cans that he wants to stock. Your middleware is running. It is counting these cans while your employee is fetching cans. So middleware runs asynchronously with the reducer, actually. So now the middleware is going to go to let's say the action stock shelf has been called, right? So your employee goes to start doing its own stock shelf business. The middleware then goes to the API. The API in this case is just the shelf, and it gets cans. It looks at all the cans there, and then it returns a number. The number that it returns is the number of cans on the shelf. So now what we're doing here is we're calling a dispatch action. So the dispatch action is then going to return a new action, and that action is going to be called update shelf, and the parameter for that action is going to be the cans that have been returned from your middleware's, counting, and the cans that were passed to the stock shelf originally. I do hope that makes sense, because in my head it sounded really run-on, but I hope we get it. Okay. So then what this does is that then it breaks, because it's done. So the difference between, I just want to explain this, because this is one concept that I had to struggle to get. Dispatching an action and nexting an action. When you dispatch an action, it goes back, that action, it goes back to the beginning of the middleware. So now think of it like this. The middleware is called every time an action is dispatched, right? So if you have, let's say you have one middleware and you have another one after it, the purpose of the first middleware is to maybe collect a value. The purpose of the second middleware is to log that value. Now, if in the first middleware you say next, it's just going to go straight to the second middleware. If in the second middleware you're also returning a next action, then it's going to pass it to the reducer, because it's done with the middlewares. But if in the second middleware you call a dispatch, that dispatch is going to trigger the store again, and then it's going to go back to the first middleware. I hope that makes sense. So basically, when you're dispatching actions within middlewares, you need to be careful to not fall into a loop of constantly going through stores and everything. Okay, so that was that for and I feel like personally, custom middleware, writing your own middleware, it's just a lot of work. So if you can, or if you want to, just use the plugins. So yeah, this is what I'm talking about. So in Redux, you have the apply middleware function. It literally comes inbuilt with the Redux package, so you don't need to import anything else. And then in the apply middleware function, this is where you can apply your middlewares that you've created. So that's the thing I was saying. So here you have middleware A, B, and C. If in middleware B, you're calling a next action, it's just going to pass it to middleware C. But if in middleware B, you call a dispatch action, it's going to go all the way back to middleware A. From middleware A, it's going to go to middleware B, and then to middleware C. So technically, the only thing that's breaking it is the type of action you're calling. Hope that makes sense. Okay, so I realized that the thing with virtual talks is I can't really gauge the audience reaction. So if at any point you have any question with anything, you could just write it down in the Q&A, and I will totally go over it again, because trying to make this understandable, basically. Okay, and then the types of middleware we can use. Like I said, writing custom middleware, bit of a drag, so you don't want to do that, and that's why we use already existing middleware packages. So the most common one actually is Redox Thunk. It is, how it works is that it basically just allows you to write middleware kind of like reducers, right? So it's just like a basic JavaScript approach to writing middleware. Then slightly more complex ones are Redox Saga and Redox Observable. Redox Saga is based on the concept of generators and a bunch of stuff that I'm not going to get into. And Redox Observable is based on the concept of reactive programming, the RxJS library, and then it uses observables to actually return these values and update your return your actions accordingly. So I'm going to be talking about Redox Observable. They all have their pros and their cons. Really, the main reason I'm using Redox Observable is because that's what I used at work, and that's what I was using when I was exploring this concept. So if it really depends on you which you want to use, like I said, the technology, it will do the same thing. So it's just whatever you prefer. So yeah, getting started with Redox Observable. Okay, so Redox Observable is an RxJS based middleware for Redux. So it was built with RxJS, so it works like reactive programming. It gets the observables, it has the observers, it returns your stream of data and everything. So how you write it, so it's just like, this is the updated version of that, or this is the Redox Observable version of the custom middleware that we called earlier. So how it works, you have your update shelf epic, so not update shelf middleware. And then you can see that here, we're not passing in millions of actions, millions of functions. We're just collecting the action, basically. Then we're piping this action. So piping is basically like an operator that it takes in different, it's an operator that takes in different operators or functions. So the first function we have here is of type. Of type is synonymous to switch, action type, case, everything. So it's just saying if the action passed in is of this type, that is of type stock shelf, then merge map. Merge map is a function to kind of like merge your results and return them in an observable. The catch with Redux Observable is that you do need to like understand the concepts of observables. I need to use RxJS, and the learning curve is a bit high, but I do think for like what I needed to use it for, which is like handling API calls and everything, is actually it does it well, right? So inside here, we're still running the same shelf API that we ran previously. We're getting the values that we got, and we're mapping our response, and we're just returning an action update. So whenever you're using a middleware, you always need to return an action. If you don't return an action, nothing is going to be passed the reducer, and it's like your state will not be updated. So even if you don't want to return another action, you need to return like you return action done then, or action of type nothing. So the point is, with every middleware, you just need to return an action. So just to recap, middleware, basically what it does is that it takes in the action, it carries out a process, and then it returns the modified action. And then that is what is passed to the reducer, and that is what goes on from there. Okay, so and then also the same thing, passing it to the store. With middleware, you just need to call the create epic middleware from Redux Observable, and then you just pass that to the apply middleware function in your create store, and that's fine. Okay, so that was that for the the concepts. I do hope they were understandable. So I'm just going to go into a little demo with the with Redux Observable. So I have the source code here if you all want to go through it. That'd be fun. And I have the my slides here as well. This is the link to my slides, so you can also go through those. Then, yeah, so let's just demo this. How do I know if this has clicked or not? Okay. I think you all can see my screen. Yeah, you should be able to. Okay. So here, this is like a simple. I'm not actually going to write code because I refuse to do live coding. It's no. Okay, so this is like a simple application that should just return. Basically, what it does is that it authorizes and unauthorizes a user. So you're passing your name. Let's say testing. And then you authorize it. So when you authorize it, what it does is that it passes that value that you've authorized to localhost. Now, this passing to localhost is the side effect we're talking about. And this is what we do with Redux middleware to handle that side effect. So when you authorize it, you see that it sets that value in localhost, and then that state property is called here. And also when you unauthorize, it removes the value from localhost. Okay, so now we're just going to explore the code for how this works since you've seen the demo. So we're just going to go to the code and see how the process of middleware would work in like a real life application. And share my screen again. I need to share my screen again. Yeah. Okay, so I'm going to stop sharing. And then I'm going to share the yeah, I'm sure. I'm going to share the code. Okay. So I'm guessing we can see this now. I hope so. Okay, so first thing, let's start from the component that would call this, basically. I think we'll start from the component that will call it, and then we'll work our way around and just see how it works. So here we have our login container components. This uses the connect from, let me zoom in just a bit. Yeah. So we have our login container components. It uses the connect key from React Redux, and then it just connects the login component and it maps the properties. So I'm not really going to explain this because that's not the point. So that's what we have here. And then if we go to our store, within our store, we have our epics. So now this epic is being called, this action epic is called when the type authorized events, authorized action is called. So it maps that action. So this right here is the side effect we're talking about. This is literally the only reason we need to use this entire structure, just so we can set things in local storage. So this is the side effect. It sets it in local storage, and then it returns the type no operation. So no operation is basically just saying there's no more action. If I returned a different type of action, then that action would also be passed to another epic, and so on and so on. But no operation, it just returns nothing, and that is what is passed to the reducer. So here you set your local storage, and here in your unauthorized epic, you're removing your local storage. Epics have the same platform as reducers, like the same concept as reducers. So when you can combine reducers, you can also combine epics. So you just combine your epics here into your root epic, and then where you're configuring your store, you're just going to call that root epic and then the create epic middleware, and then that's what you pass into here. And then it runs that root epic, and so every single time you call that particular action in your code, that action is going to be intercepted by the epic middleware. It's going to carry out the modifications, and then it's going to pass it on to your reducer, and your reducer is just going to, reduce it. Okay, and yeah, that's about that with code. Once again, going to switch my screen. Gonna go back to this. Yeah, great. So going back here, all right, so that's about that. Then if you guys want to read up more on Redux or writing Redux middleware or Redux Observable, I put some links to some things that I think are some articles that I found useful. So you guys can go check them out. And yeah, that is about that on that. So I do hope this talk was understandable, because that was what I was going for. I was hoping to explain the concepts in a way that'd be easy to understand. And I would love to take any questions that you guys have, because I think I have like 10 minutes for questions. So yeah, that is that. And the cat says bye. So bye.
I will drop in one. Will share my screen for a while. Just if suddenly someone can't find where is possibility to ask question. I know the developers know everything, but still sometimes you're only humans. Okay. Is my okay. So yeah, in the top right corner with 3 arrows, there's possibility to write some question. And as I wrote already in comments, that don't worry if you don't see your question immediately in a line, because at first I have to approve them. That's not my weakness to approve, it's just how Teams works. So meanwhile, sorry, yeah, Jemima, I forgot to tell 3 sentences about you in the beginning, but just
you can tell them now.
I think already you told everything except about your obsession with cats.
Haha, yeah.
How did it happen? How did you get upset with cats?
What happened was I found 5 cats. I found like these kittens that were abandoned when I was in university. There were these kittens that were abandoned in one of the classes that we had, and then I was like, oh no, poor dears, and then I took them in. And some people would say 5 cats is like a lot if you've never had a pet before, but I think 5 cats is the appropriate amount of cats to introduce yourself to. Yeah. So I just took. They're just great, cats are just great.
Yeah, my kids would agree with you that 5 cats is like the right amount.
Exactly.
And also you said that you're spending quite much time on watching slice of life anime.
Yes, slice of life anime, because well, it's life, but in anime form. Anime just makes everything look like slice of like Studio Ghibli. It just makes everything look amazing. You know, like you'll be riding the bus and it looks like the most magical thing you've ever done, and I just like it.
I see. So I at the moment I don't see any question written in. So I maybe let's do it this now that this is kind of break time. So for those people who want to have break before Majid's talk, then let's have now 5 minute break. And in the same time, if there, oh, okay, here is one question coming in. So yeah, let's do it this way that those who don't have questions can have break or can listen answers.
Okay.
And
So do I read the question out, or can everyone see it?
I'm not sure that I assume that everybody should see them.
All right. Well, I'll just read it out then.
Yeah. Okay. You read out.
Okay, great. So Rue says, I'm early in my React journey, but I've had some experience with context and also heard good things about MobX. How does Redux stack up with these, and is it worth the learning curve? Okay. Good question. I personally have not worked with MobX before. I have used contexts. What I've seen from using context and using Redux is that I think Redux, just because of like the pure state flow that it has, you know, you have one store and you just need to initialize it within your, like you just pass the store to the provider and that's passed to the entire app. I think for me, it was easier than when I was using context because it was less about managing the store, like less about managing the global state itself and just about managing the updates to the states. For the learning curve, I would say it is a bit more tricky than context, but also from what I've seen in a professional context, in a professional environment, I have seen Redux used more than context. So I would say you may have an added advantage if you learn Redux over context. But once again, like I said, it depends strictly on your app. If you're doing something that does not require really maintaining a lot of state changes or anything, then context is fine. You can just use it like in the scope of a small application and it would be fine. If you just want to learn Redux for the heck of it, then go right ahead. I hope that answered your question.
Yeah, right now, no more questions at the moment, but we still have like 3 minutes for a break. So if anything shows up, then we can answer.
All right, I'll be here.
Yeah. You turned off your video?
Yeah. Do you want to turn it back on? I will. I was just, I was trying to slide out.
Let's wait for a while. Yeah.
Okay.
Those 3 minutes of fame are still your 3 minutes.
Yeah. So is this break right now, or is this still my 40 minutes?
In Devclub we take life quite in a quite chill mode. So there is no strict timing. It's not conference. It's meetup. So normally we never have started in a time. It's like today was most in time start than ever. Usually we wait like 5 minutes while people come in and then, or even 8 minutes and only then start. But it's a bit different because usually people come from work and it's just different than to connect online. So yeah, shortly it's not so strict. So how is it? How is it life when you come from Nigeria to Lithuania? Is there?
Well, I always say there were like two major culture shocks for me. So number one would be the weather, obviously, because when I left Lagos, I think it was 36 degrees, and I got to Lithuania and it was 4 degrees, and whoosh, it it was not a fun transition. And then also the quiet. I don't know if you guys know this, but it's like really quiet here. There's hardly any background noise. In Nigeria, there's always the sound of cars or the sound of generators or just people in general. You can just like really feel people talking. All right, we have another question from Nikita Kuselev. Did I say that right? I don't know.
Nikita Koshylev.
Oh, thank you, Nikita Koshylev. Amazing. Okay, so they say, I am mostly a backend developer. What is the most optimal way to move into the JavaScript frontend dev? A bunch of courses from Coursera or constructing your own app while Googling a lot? Okay, I would say it depends on how you work. Now, personally, I would use more building my own apps. But if you're the kind of person that you like to understand the underlying concepts behind things, like you want to know why things are done this way and not just how to do them, then I would say you should take an online course. I think for JavaScript, I always recommend Free Code Camp, just because for me it has the best beginner integration, and there are forums and there's a lot of like support for it, so it's always easy to find answers. But then also, if you're the kind of person that you just want to know how to do things and you don't particularly care about the underlying concepts, then just build applications, build as much stuff as you can build, just throw it all out there.
Okay, thank you, Jemima, very much for your time and work, and
no problem.
Hopefully we can meet in a FrontCon in August.
Hopefully, yes.
Yeah.
All right, thank you for having me, and I hope everyone is staying safe and just dealing with this fine. All right, bye.